All right. Well, hello again, everyone. Today will mark the next installment on our the portion of the class on ethics and extending moral considerability to things that are not traditionally understood as being morally considerable. Today, we're going to be looking at ecosystems, and our major figure today is Aldo Leopold, who is a really, really famous environmental ethicist, actually one of the very first environmental ethicists from the 70s, and really kind of started that whole field. So we're going to be thinking about moral considerability beyond human interests. Okay, so recall that we talked about anthropocentrism, syntheocentrism, biocentrism. Today, we're going to be focused on ecocentrism, which is the view that ecosystems themselves have moral considerability, not necessarily or not just all of the constitutive members of an ecosystem, but the ecosystem itself as a whole. So we can think about individualism versus holism. Individualism is marking the individual members of an ecosystem or of some kind of system as being morally considerable. But holism is the view that the entirety, the collection of the things has moral merit in and of itself, right? And so when we're thinking about ecocentrism, we are extending our moral consideration to the ecosystem itself, right? So the idea here is that we have to have some moral reason in order to negatively affect the ecosystem. And so what gets to count as good reasons for, say, damaging the ecosystem? These are questions that we can debate about, right? But the idea is that we need such a reason to damage the ecosystem. Okay, so we're talking about ecosystems. Well, what the hell is an ecosystem? John Nolt, actually a really close friend of mine from the University of Tennessee, defines an ecosystem as an assemblage of organisms of different species living in some degree of interdependence in the same habitat, together with the non-living components of that habitat, soil and water and sunlight, etc., air and such. So the idea, the key word of this definition is interdependence, right? So the members of an ecosystem do not exist independently of one another, right? Um, Rather, they depend upon one another, right? All of the rungs and all of the members of an ecosystem depend on the well functioning of the rest of the ecosystem and the members of the rest of the ecosystem in order to continue to survive, right? So this idea is gonna be relevant a little bit later, but the idea here is, look, I mean, like we humans, right? We are in some sense dependent on the land, on the soil, because the soil gives us various goods, right? The soil gives us food. And so we can't exist, at least like naturally, we can't exist without a relationship with plants, right? So we exist in an interdependent relationship with, say, plants and the soil. In a similar way, the soil depends on us for various things too. And I'm not like an ecologist, so I don't know what those things are. But the idea here is that in principle, the soil and various plants depend on us as well. Okay, so, what is the value of an ecosystem, right? So, we can go with either an anthropocentric or human-centered option or a non-anthropocentric option. The anthropocentric option is what is labeled as ecosystem services, and this is Leopold's target in the article or in the book. So the idea with ecosystem services is basically like, how do we maintain the ecosystem in such a way to keep it like healthy, quote unquote, such that it can serve human ends, right? How do we maintain our human ends without destroying the ecosystem such that we can no longer achieve those ends, right? And so the idea is that the ecosystem is only valuable insofar as it helps us meet various human ends, right? And then we want to maintain the ecosystem so that we can get those things that we want, right? Okay, and so then we can contrast this with a non-anthropocentric option, right? So the idea is that, look, the ecosystem has moral merit or moral value independent of our own interests, right? So, for example, the ecosystem may have a form of autonomy, right? And maybe that is what makes the ecosystem valuable, right? Or it might be that the ecosystem has some degree of health, right? So things can go better or worse for the ecosystem, right? It can be well functioning or it can be poorly functioning, and that's the basis of its value. Or we might think of the ecosystem as valuable insofar as the value of all the members of that ecosystem are taken into consideration, right? So all of the individual members of the ecosystem are valuable, and so that makes the whole of the ecosystem valuable too, right? So we could think about how the ecosystem is, or how ecosystems are valuable in different ways. Okay, and now we're going to turn to The Land Ethic by Aldo Leopold. So here's Leopold's argument, kind of in a nutshell. So remember, we talked about interdependence. So the members of the food chain that are higher depend on things that are lower on the food chain. Similarly, things that are lower on the food chain, in some sense, depend upon the members of the higher parts of the food chain, right? So they depend on one another. Higher things that are higher up on the food chain, things that are lower on the food chain, all depend upon one another. It follows from 1 and 2 that all parts of the ecosystem are interdependent, right? And so that means that every species, no matter where it falls on the food chain, will always depend on things that are lower or things that are higher than itself. Or if it's the lowest thing, it's going to depend on all the higher things. Or if it's the highest thing, it's going to depend on all of the lower things, right? Okay. Okay. So when we talk about interdependence, we're saying that no part of the food chain, no part of the ecosystem is more important than the others because they're all equally dependent upon one another. Okay. So it follows then that humans as a species are no more important than any other parts of the ecosystem. Okay. So humans as a species, us, right? We depend upon every other part of the ecosystem. And it follows from that that we are no more important than anything else that's in the ecosystem. Okay, and then we get a conditional premise 6. If humans are not more important than the other parts of the ecosystem, then it is wrong to make decisions regarding the environment that prioritize its impact on ourselves. The idea there is that it's wrong to prioritize human interests over and above the interests of the other members of the ecosystem, right? So if humans aren't more important than other members of the ecosystem, right, then it follows that it's wrong to prioritize human interests. Okay, and then the conclusion is that it is wrong to prioritize human interests over the interests of the other members of the ecosystem, right? So this is what we might call ecocentrism, right? This is one way to flesh out an ecocentric ethic. Okay, so the title of this work is The Land Ethic. And by land, he means ecosystem, right? And so he means the interdependent relations between all members and all species of a given area, a given habitat, right? Um, Okay, and so this is when I was talking about the food chain, right? This is kind of what that might look like. So the producers are, in some sense, dependent on the soil, on the herbivores, on the omnivores, and the carnivores, and so on and so forth. And so each member of this pyramid is dependent upon all of the other members of the pyramid as well. And so humans will likely fall at apex predators, right? We're pretty high up on the food chain. But we couldn't continue to survive without other carnivores, without omnivores, without herbivores, without primary producers in soil, right? So we are just as dependent on everything else in the ecosystem as everything else in the ecosystem is dependent on us in some way. So ethics is the regulating factors of this continued cooperation between the different members of the ecosystem, right? So ethics is intended to regulate that value, right? And so things are wrong insofar as they tend to work against this system, right? So if we were to say blow up a mountain range, right, to strip mine for coal, that would be wrong according to Leopold's land ethic, right? Because it's destroying various parts of the ecosystem as well as prioritizing human interests. It breaks strip mining breaks this relationship that we have to the land, and in some sense damages the land. And given that we can't prioritize our own interests, um, that would make strip mining wrong potentially. Right. That's the idea. Okay, so um, so we might wonder, what are some of the implications of Leopold's land ethic, right? So there are going to be some parts, or there are going to be some cases where it's okay to kill things that are in the ecosystem, right? So imagine invasive species, right, like kudzu, or maybe like wild boars in East Tennessee, right? Uh, these are examples of invasive species. These species kind of take over the ecosystem and destroy members of the ecosystem that were already there, right? So in some way, Asian carp is another example, but in some way, invasive species work against the natural ecosystem that's there, right? And so Le- uh, Leopold's view has to be open to killing these other species, right? In order to preserve the kind of eco whole, right? In order to preserve the ecosystem against those species. So it's not that like killing animals is always going to be wrong, right? No, it's like this is actually an ethic that allows for hunting only if it's beneficial for the rest of the ecosystem, right? And in virtue of, say, killing boars, we are not necessarily prioritizing human interests. Rather, we are prioritizing the interest of the ecosystem itself, right? So the idea here is that uh, Leopold's land ethic will not always say that killing other living beings is wrong. Okay, so these are a couple of quotes, right? And we might wonder, okay, if it's never wrong, or like if it can be okay to kill another like living being according to Leopold's land ethic, um, we and if we're not going to prioritize human interests, and if humans aren't more important than any other part of the ecosystem, it might mean that in some cases we ought to kill human beings in order to preserve the ecosystem, right? So this possibility is very, very open, or at least Leopold's land ethic is very open to this possibility, right? Because um, uh, because it can be okay to kill a living being. Humans are no important than any other being in the ecosystem. And so if humans disrupt ecosystems, it might mean that we can attack or kill those human beings, right? Such that we preserve the ecosystem. This seems like a wildly counterintuitive implication of his view, and might mean that his view needs to be reworked such that we don't have this very strange implication. So anyway, I'm going to leave you with that. You might think about how Leopold could respond to this objection, and you'll be writing a discussion post about this soon enough. All right, bye bye.